His name was Arthur Seyss-Inquart. He was a notorious anti-Semite. He was responsible for the incarceration and deportation of thousands of Jews and others to concentration camps. He had this portrait of himself painted probably by a Jew who was a prisoner, and he had it painted on a Torah scroll. And this was a way for the Nazis to, not only, exterminate the Jews, but to destroy their culture and humiliate them in ways
literally that, paint over their culture with his face. The Institute for Jewish Research, known as YIVO, maintains the largest collection of documents and artifacts pertaining to Eastern European Jewish life. Its knowledge was not, however, always kept safe behind the Institute's impressive walls. Much of it was recovered, literally unearthed, after brave researchers formed a brigade to smuggle it away from Nazis. Today at YIVO, that which was underground is finally being brought to light.
Scholars got together and they decided that the time had come, partly because of the dangers that were felt by modernity on the one hand. World War I taught them that the Jewish population of Eastern Europe and Russia was under grave threat. So they got together in Berlin in 1925 to discuss creating an institute that would study their history and try to preserve it. So the study of history was an attempt at preserving what we call the Vilna collections, that original component of YIVO that was accumulated between 1925, when it was founded, and 1941, when it was destroyed. That's about 2 million, 2.5 million, maybe 3 million documents. We have 23 million documents.
Goodness.
We have materials from all over the Jewish world.
From this point here, these are the materials that were shipped to Germany from Vilna during the war, and that goes to this shelf right here.
This one.
Right. All this material right here is the material that was smuggled out of the YIVO building during the war.
Gotcha.
And buried in the ghetto.
Yeah.
And then smuggled out of the Soviet Union.
It says series Vilna
Right,
Ghetto on all of these. This is the stuff that they literally pulled up from underground.
Right.
Wow.
In June 1941, the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union, and Vilna is overrun, and the Nazis occupy Vilna. So there was an institute called, in Frankfurt, called the Institute for Research on the Jewish Question. And essentially, that was an organization that was created to research Jews without Jews. They organized a slave labor brigade of Jews from the ghetto to leave the ghetto every day and come to the YIVO building to catalog and pack these materials and send it to Germany to be part of this Institute for Research on the Jewish Question. This is the collection of Nachman Blumenthal. This was a man who was a prisoner in the Lodz ghetto, and he survived the liquidation of the ghetto, and after it was liquidated, he was forced by the Germans to clean up the ghetto. And what he did was he started to clean up ghetto offices, and he began to collect materials and hide them in various places in the ghetto. When the Nazis were driven out and the war ended, he went back to the ghetto and began to dig them up, and in 1947 he donated them to YIVO.
It's like Peter Pan, He comes at the beginning and he's lost his shadow. And he can't live without his shadow. You have to have your shadow. And that's what YIVO is doing. We are stitching the shadow back to ourselves because it was ripped away.
The shadow is what happens when you cast light on something. So you're kind of doing both.
Yeah.
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 What do we have on the shelf here behind me?
So we have the Papers of Hias, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Each one of them has just all of these
Yeah,
papers and letters,
You're
and
never sure like how each paper is related. It could be a State Department paper, it could be just
exactly,
a letter somebody wrote.
exactly. And at the end of the day, the volunteers' hands are black. You can see even
Oh, yeah.
my fingers, just from touching a few,
Yeah.
are, you know, just. One of those is the case file of Otto Frank, which of course is Anne Frank's father. Obviously, we know that Otto Frank was unsuccessful in getting his family out, and in fact, Otto Frank is the only one of his family members that survived the war. His wife and 2 daughters die. But you know, reading through this file, you just see the desperate measures that he takes to try to get his family out. So it says, we were advised that a Mr. Julius Hollander and his brother Walter had provided affidavits for Mr. and Mrs. Frank and their family. Another affidavit had been given for the mother of the 2 brothers Hollander. These were sent to Holland on May 10, 1941. Mr. Walter Hollander procured a supplementary affidavit of support from his employer. Another affidavit was given by another stranger. The latter 2 affidavits were used for the 2 children of Mr. Otto Frank. The affidavits submitted by Julius and Walter Hollander were for Mr. and Mrs. Frank and for their mother, Mrs. Rosa Hollander, who was living with the Franks in Holland.
It's paperwork. It's just government paperwork. Somebody just put a piece of paper in a typewriter on Wednesday. And people died. Sorry, that's. Whew.
So this is a logbook from Auschwitz. It's a to and from book. It's a coming and going book. It's entering the block and then leaving the block. Leaving the block usually means you're dead.
Yeah. And the handwriting's the same. That's also, it's like,
Yeah, because
insofar, like this was just one dude's job. Like I'm looking, he does his K's and his L's stupid. And he just sat there writing them down and then probably just crayoned them all off.
Yeah.
Because that was his job.
Right.
Is there anyone who isn't crossed out?
No, everyone is pretty much crossed out. No one survived. And you know what's interesting is really this is just part of the administrativa of death in a concentration camp.
It's a notebook, like it's a regular black notebook.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
everybody.
So this is a book of Rosh Hashanah, or New Year's greetings, presented to Mordechai Chaim Ronkowski, the head of the Judenrat. From all of the children who were in the Lodz Ghetto school system. They wrote a greeting to Ronkowski saying, you know, thank you, you know, for the food that you provide or for the schooling that you provide. It's because he really was in charge of oftentimes rations and, you know, and those things. There were about a little over 14,000 children plus over 700 teachers.
Do you know about how old?
So everything from elementary to several vocational schools that existed in the ghetto. Out of these 14,000 some odd children, only 200 of them survived the war. So this book contains, you know, the last remnants of these kids. You know, these signatures are what, you know, is left behind of most of these children.
It's overwhelming because, I mean, they didn't know that might be the last anyone might ever have of their name. If they didn't have siblings who had children who survived, then like that's all you get.
Nachman Blumenthal was an ordinary high school teacher. He happened to, at the outbreak of the war, he happened to find himself in the Soviet zone, And there he stayed, but his wife and child were not in the German zone, and they were murdered. After the war, he comes back. And though his heart may have been filled with vengeance, and should have been, in my view, he did something remarkable. Instead of killing the guy who had shot his wife and his son, he interviewed him. I mean, think about this. And not only did he interview him, but he interviewed all of the people in the town who observed this Polish policeman who had shot his wife and son.
These are Blumenthal's handwritten notes on interviews he conducted with Poles who were there, with onlookers who were there when his wife and son were picked up by the police officer and eventually murdered. You know, and so you can see that it's very difficult to read. It's in Polish, but part of the account states that people just were standing around watching while the police officers forced his wife to undress first the son and then herself. So his wife was masquerading as a Christian, and you know, of course, the son, once they took his clothes off, they could very easily see that he was a Jew. And just, you know, the account goes on to say that people, you know, were standing there. You know, inside of here is the leather shoe of Ariel Blumenthal, of Nachman Blumenthal's son, when presumably he exhumed the body, and the cross that his wife was wearing.
She was pretending to be.
She was pretending,
Christian.
right?
He was one of the founders of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and he was one of the founders of the project of what was called the Historical Commissions after the war to take eyewitness testimony. One of the most important things that is contained in this archive is his work on Nazi language. And so he began a study of Nazi language, so that someone who was gassed was said to have simply exited. Human beings were called inventory. Someone who is who comes into Auschwitz checks in. So it's like a hotel. And he traces this in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different ways in the Nazi perversion of the German language. Paying attention to the smallest things. That's what YIVO is all about. That's what art is all about. Paying attention to details. And what this whole institute is trying to tell you is that every detail matters. This pen, these glasses, this thing. We don't even know what these are, but 100 years from now, you look at this, you'll say, oh yeah, that tells you something significant about that moment.
The Blumenthal collection is only the most recent archive to make its way to YIVO, and it's impossible to know how much more knowledge is waiting to be rediscovered. At YIVO, everything has a place and a purpose, and nothing is too small to matter to the great work of rebuilding a heritage lost.